My name is Nikki Van, and I work for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I am joined today by my colleague, Diana Maxwell, and over the next 20 minutes, we will give you an overview of the National Trust, our work, and we will provide you with information on resources that we hope will help you more effectively undertake important preservation work in your communities. Thank you for having us. The National Trust for Historic Preservation is a privately funded nonprofit organization that works to save America's historic places. We protect significant places representing our diverse cultural experiences by taking direct action and inspiring broad public support. We are the cause that inspires Americans to save the places where history happened. We are the cause that connects us to our diverse past, weaving a multicultural nation together. We are the cause that celebrates our country's architectural heritage and beauty. We are the cause that transforms communities from places where we live into places that we love. As the leading voice for preservation, we are the cause for people saving places, and we have been doing this work for 75 years. We do this work in a number of ways. We advocate at the federal, local, and state levels for preservation-friendly policies, and we provide legal resources to help communities ensure that preservation laws are being enforced. We undertake cutting-edge research on long-standing and emerging preservation issues and serve as a thought leader in the preservation movement. We are the leading national voice on preservation, and we communicate with the public through our own media channels and Preservation Magazine, as well as through speaking engagements, op-eds, and other external outlets. We draw attention to preservation by clustering our work into thematic issues. One highly successful example of this is the National Trust annual 11 Most Endangered list. Since 1988, we've drawn attention to more than 350 places that were threatened in some way, and only a handful have been lost. We engage the public at our historic sites and historic hotels through travel opportunities and through volunteer and training opportunities, including our hands-on preservation experience or Hope Crew program. We bring people together both in person and virtually and provide education and training on a host of topics. In fact, the reason we can't be with you today is that we are gearing up for our annual Pass Forward conference, which will be held in New Orleans starting on Monday. While everything we do is focused on preservation places, we do this work most directly through our National Trust historic sites. Today, the 28 sites in the National Trust portfolio represent both geographical and cultural diversity, and together they tell unforgettable stories about our nation's heritage. Through our subsidiaries, the National Trust provides resources that help create more prosperous communities. Main Street America is the leader in preservation-based economic development, helping communities across the nation revitalize their downtowns and historic commercial districts. The National Trust Community Investment Corporation, a for-profit subsidiary of the National Trust, makes equity investments in real estate projects qualifying for federal and state historic tax credits, low-income housing, and new market tax credits. Since 2000, NTCIC has provided tax credits financing of over $1.5 billion. The National Trust for Historic Preservation has been providing grants to preservation projects for more than 50 years. Last year, the National Trust awarded over $13 million to hundreds of preservation projects nationwide. Through various programs, we fund everything from planning to education to capacity building to brick and mortar restorations. Grants range from $2,500 for planning work to up to $250,000 for larger restoration projects. At this point, I will turn the presentation over to Diana to discuss our grant program in more detail.
Thank you, Nikki. So today you've gotten the basics on the National Trust, and now I'm going to spend some time talking about a number of grant programs that we have, as well as some tips and tricks that you may want to use if you apply for our grant program. So our largest program in terms of number of awards made is the National Trust Preservation Funds program. This is an umbrella term for a collection of 57 individually endowed funds. So this map represents our funding over a 5-year period and is fairly representative of the concentration of where our funds are directed geographically. Our endowed funds are largely geographically restricted by either state or region, and we don't have funds dedicated to every state as evidenced by the map. And while we don't have funds specific to every state, we do have a handful of funds that are nationally competitive, and the program does have a national reach. Sorry, I lost my notes for a second. The National Trust Preservation Funds were designed to support preservation planning and education projects. These are generally from $25,000 to $10,000, and they're open to nonprofit organizations and government agencies, which in addition to a town or city can include something like a school district. These funds do require a dollar for dollar match, but the funds are paid upfront upon granting, and then you have a year, excuse me, to complete both the project and to raise the required match. The program has 3 annual deadlines, and the next comes up on February 1st, so you have some time to get an application in. And while we do have 3 set deadlines, we also have the ability to grant from these funds throughout the year in emergency situations, such as a natural disaster or other unforeseen threat or issue. In addition to these state-specific funds I just talked about, the Trust also has a number of national funds that may be of interest. Each of these funds has their own set of guidelines and features that make them different from our standard grants. And you can read about the guidelines for all of our programs on our website. As you'll see here, 3 of the funds allow for grants up to $15,000, and the Favreau and Mitchell funds can be used for brick and mortar work or physical preservation work, as well as planning and interpretation. We'll be accepting applications for the Favreau and Mitchell grant programs in early spring, and the Hart Fund will be later in the summer. The last bullet here, the Peter H. Brink Leadership Fund, supports direct mentoring and provides funds to cover travel and meeting costs associated with peer-to-peer learning. So these funds are awarded on a rolling basis. And if you have a mentor, perhaps you've met at this program, you have somebody you want to meet up with, go see their site, they come to see yours, do some peer-to-peer mentoring, you can send us an email and we can tell you how to get the application for that program. Another major initiative is our National Fund for Sacred Places program. This program was established in 2016 to provide technical and financial support for active congregations by building the capacity and increasing the stability of these critical yet disappearing historic community centers. We're not going to spend much time on this program, as you'll be hearing about it in more detail in a few minutes from our colleague, Jennifer Sandy. Another one of the National Trust's major initiatives is our African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund program, which is a preservation campaign to preserve and protect places that have been overlooked in American history and represent centuries of African American activism, achievement, and resilience. Since launching the Action Fund in 2017, the National Trust has awarded over $16 million for African American history, supporting the preservation of more than 200 places to date across the country. This is a highly competitive program, but it supports a range of preservation activities, including capital projects, organizational capacity building, preservation planning, and programming and interpretation. And within this overall program, there are specific initiatives to fund Black churches, historically Black colleges and universities, and modernist sites designed by Black architects. Further information about this program and upcoming deadlines can be found on the website that you can see there on the screen. So for all of our grants, we'll have different guidelines, but the basic criteria you see here on the screen is fairly universal across all of our programs. Some of these things, such as the organization's capacity to complete the project, the feasibility of the timeline and the budget, and the likelihood of success are pretty common criteria for much of the funding, either ours or others that you would apply for. In addition, the National Trust considers the historic resource, community, and history itself, its significance to the community, its ability to tell stories that resonate with people, and the degree to which it tells stories that advance our goal of telling the full history of the United States. We're also interested in the degree to which a project fits into our current priorities. The National Impact Agenda, our current programmatic focus, lays out a set of 7 goals for the preservation community to create a more inclusive, collaborative, and modern movement that tackles today's challenges. We also want to draw attention to our National Preservation Awards program. So once you've applied for that grant and received it, and once you've finished your project and it's a great success, this is what you're looking out for. Each year, the National Trust honors the best of preservation through our National Preservation Awards, and nominations are accepted in 7 categories, and award recipients are selected by external juries comprised of leading voices in the preservation and allied fields. The awards honor both individuals and projects, and they recognize the full range of preservation. The nomination period is closed for 2024, but we anticipate opening the nominations for 2025 in the coming weeks, and we'll be announcing the awards at a ceremony at our Pass Forward conference. So that's the kind of brief update or overview of our grant program. And now I just want to share with you a few things that we have found make for a really good grant application. We see good, bad, and mediocre applications. The best ones don't need to be written by professional grant writers or development staff, though that can help. And the 2 most important things for a good grant application go back to elementary school. You need to follow the directions and answer the question. So if we ask you for a certain photo, submit the photo. We have a reason for that. Questions that have a character or a word count, stay within that, or you're not going to be able to submit your answer. And then you're not going to be able to submit the full application. The next part can be a little bit trickier. You need to give us the information we're asking for without going overboard, but also without assuming we know your site or anything about it. So if you don't tell us anything about the site's history, because it's so obvious to you, but if we've never been to or seen the site, we don't know for sure if it's historic. We've seen applications like that. If we have to go to Google to try to understand the site's history, you're probably not going to get a grant. On the other side, rabbit holes are great fun, but we don't need to know every single fact of a site in any application, particularly if it's not relevant to what you're asking for. If your church congregation is from 1700, but you moved into your current building in 1930, and that's what the project's based on, we don't need a detailed description of who built the original church that isn't the focus of the project. So you got to balance that, right? And then the last is that you need to apply for the right project. If your roof is caving in, you shouldn't be applying for an interior paint job. It's overly simplistic, but we can tell if an organization has thought out their project. We're taking a risk and giving a grant, and if that risk doesn't make sense, we're probably not going to give that grant. And finally, the grant application doesn't need to be written by a professional. We get applications from volunteers, from staff, from professional grant writers, and we've granted to all of those applications. If you have someone who can be clear and understands the site and the project, you don't need to hire a professional to write the grant. So normally at this point in a session, we take questions from the audience, but thanks to the magic of pre-recording, we can't do that today. But we can answer some of the questions that we get asked most often, because we do see a lot of frequently asked questions. So Nikki, you want to go ahead and ask those questions and I can answer them for you?
Absolutely. So Diana, how do people apply?
Sure. So about 6 to 8 weeks before the grant deadline, we'll open up the grant application in our online grant system, and you'll need to set up an account if you don't have one already, fill out that form and submit it before the deadline. So you can sign up for our grants email list at our website to get notification when grants are open, and then they'll also have a link to the grant guidelines as well as the grant application.
Yeah, so often people want to know if they can apply for more than one grant at a time.
Yeah, and we don't generally recommend this. Your organization or you as a board or you as a person should be determining the project that really needs to happen right now, that addresses your most urgent needs, and that you're prepared to undertake and apply for. and we won't give 2 grants to an organization in the same grant round. So sometimes if 2 come in, we're going to make the call on those grant projects of which one seems more important to us, which might not be the same one that's most important to you. So just send us one.
People often ask if they can apply for a second grant if they've already received one.
Yep. An organization can have up to 3 grants in any 2-year period, but note that we can't fund the same project in more than once. So if you have a phased project, we could fund phase 1 and then a couple years later, phase 2, but we can't fund phase 1 over and over.
Okay. The application asks folks to describe what a historic resource is, and this can be confusing to some people. So can you talk about that a little more?
Yeah, and this is a question we get questions on, and we also see on the application that people don't quite understand. So the historic resource is a building, a structure, a site, a landscape, a district, or a neighborhood. In short, it's the physical property or properties that your project revolves around. So if you're applying for a grant for historic preservation that's based on a place, which is why you'd be coming to us for a grant, you should have 99.9% of the time a historic resource. So we're just trying to be broad in resource basically by asking you this. So we're not limiting it to a building, we're not limiting it to a landscape, but we want to know what you're working on and what that site is. And so if you don't fill out this question, we may not understand your project as well. So if you get to this question and you are unsure if you should fill that out or it doesn't feel right, send us an email and we can help you figure that out. But most of the time you will have a historic resource.
Great. So we're coming up on our time, Diana, but I think to that point about sending us an email, can you talk a bit about what kind of feedback our staff is able to give either before application or after if an application is denied?
Yep, sure. So unfortunately, we don't have the ability to review applications and give feedback prior to a due date. We're busy answering questions about the programs and doing all of our work. But we're happy to answer any specific questions you have about the grant application or the program. Best way to reach us is via email. And then if your project is denied, we can usually give you feedback on an application. We can't guarantee it. And part of that is just because sometimes, if it's a particularly competitive program, if we had 800 applications for a program that we're going to give 12 grants to, we may not have really specific information about your project. It may be that your project just wasn't as good as, some of the others. But
the project was just as good, but perhaps others were more pressing or compelling.
There we go. Yes, that's true. There's no bad projects. So there may not be anything wrong with your application. It may just be that others seemed, more urgent or fit the guidelines a little bit better. But again, you want to email us to get those answers. Okay. And we'll do the best we can to give them.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you again. Thank you, Diana, for sharing that information. And thank you all for sitting here and listening to us for the past 20 minutes. Just leaving you with this slide here with information on where you can find more details about our program and how you can reach us if you have any questions. That email address is the best first point of contact with our team. We have 4 staff members who monitor that inbox, so it's usually the quickest way to get a hold of us. But thank you for your time, and we hope to see a flood of applications from Wisconsin and the Midwest.
My name is Paul Porter. I am the tax credit reviewer for the Eastern District of Wisconsin at the State Historic Preservation Office. I am one of 2. Our Western District Coordinator, whose district we all happen to be sitting in right now or standing, is Andrea Harris, and she came to us this year, so we're very lucky to have her with us as well. So, my presentation is about tax credits and saving sacred spaces and the adaptive reuse of them. Okay, so what is a tax credit? It differs from a tax deduction. A tax deduction lowers the amount of income that is subject to taxation. whereas a tax credit lowers the amount of the tax that's owed. $1 of tax credit reduces the amount of income tax owed by $1. And I found this cartoon because we can all relate to that whenever tax time rolls around and we're all shaking our heads and trying to figure out what do we actually owe the IRS this year. Okay, well, we have two tax credit programs. One is the 20% federal historic tax credit incentive for properties, and then we also have the 20% state historic preservation tax incentive for income producing properties, and both for-profit and nonprofits can use this program. This is a project from St. Mary of the Angels Church and Monastery in Green Bay that my predecessor Mark Beekle reviewed. But I will go into that one a little bit later in the presentation. Okay, to find out more information about the tax credits, go to our website, which is wisconsinhistory.org. And on the main page, you'll see I've circled the rightmost tile there that says Preserve Your Homes and Properties. And if you click on that, then the next screen will come up with the search bar where you can type in your name and address, or excuse me, not your name, but just the address of the property. You'll want to do it numerically, cardinally, and then by the street name. So for example, 123 West Wisconsin. Don't put in any more than that, otherwise you'll confuse the search feature in the database. So, what you're going to need to know is whether or not your building is a certified historic structure. The certified historic structure is a building that's individually listed in the National Register of Historic Places or is a contributing resource within a National Register listed historic district. If either of those apply, then you can use the 20% tax credit programs. If the answer is no, can I get my building listed in the National Register? So you would want to go to our National Register webpage, which I have the link down in the bottom right-hand corner here for you. And you'll click on the National Register questionnaire form. And in that, then you can fill the form out to see if your property is eligible for listing. And then if it is determined eligible by our Resources Evaluation Committee, then you can move forward with a nomination and with an application for tax credits. So again, here's the main page that this has the National Register questionnaire on, where you will download that form. On the 20% federal tax historic credit program, your property needs to be a certified historic structure, which I just explained in the last slide. There is a minimum investment determined by the IRS, and I will go into that in a subsequent slide. And then all work must meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation, which I'll also briefly go over in a future slide. Again, this is St. Mary of the Angels Church and Monastery in Green Bay. As part of the project, the sanctuary was rehabilitated and is still used for Mass today. And the monastery on the site was converted into apartments because obviously there weren't enough people going to seminary anymore, so they needed to figure out a new use for the building to provide income for the church. So as you notice in the photographs, you can see the original character was maintained in the hallways, the original wood floors, wainscoting doors, staircases, and etc. And then some original features were featured on the apartment side. You can see the back side of the door coming in from the hall into the new kitchen. And then there's some other features within the apartments that call out the historic character of the building. Oh, and also I wanted to mention that this particular apartment conversion created 40 housing units in Green Bay, which were really needed for the population at large. So it was a win-win all the way around. Okay, so your minimum investment to qualify for the federal program. The financial figure, it needs to be at least the adjusted basis value or $5,000, whichever financial number is larger. And how do you figure out your adjusted basis? What you do is you take the purchase price of the property, you subtract the land value at the time of the purchase, then you subtract all the depreciation that you've taken on the property, and then you add back in your capital improvements that you've made on the property. And then all work, again, needs to meet the standards. Okay. This is the state credits for income producing. They've made a recent ruling that it does need to be the adjusted basis and $50,000. All work must meet the standards. And there is a $3.5 million cap per parcel. So your project size would have to be at least $17.5 million to reach that cap. This is another project that my predecessor, Mark Beagle, did. This is St. James Episcopal in Milwaukee. This building was converted from a church into a wedding venue so that people could enjoy the setting of a church wedding, but not necessarily have to work with any particular denomination to do so. So I think it was a very successful project. Okay. This is a very helpful web page when you want to do some more in-depth looking into the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. There's 4 different types of standards to go to, but since most of our projects are adaptive reuse projects, we use the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation, because there's also ones for preservation or restoration, but 9 times out of 10, we're working on an adaptive reuse project. Okay, here's the standards, and this what we use for evaluating projects that have come in, and I'll just briefly talk about them. You should try to find a new use that is compatible to the original architecture of the building and only have minimal changes to it. The character of the property should be retained and preserved. Removing historic materials that alter the appearance of the building should be avoided. Each property is recognized as a physical record of its time and place. Sometimes buildings change over time, and you have to evaluate whether or not those changes have become significant in their own right. And distinctive features, finishes, and construction techniques of craftsmanship are things you should look at and consider when designing your project. When you have deteriorated historic features, your first line is to try to repair them, but if they are too far deteriorated, you want to replace in kind and match the original materials. Chemical or physical treatments can be damaging to historic buildings, so you want to avoid them whenever possible. Always think of the gentlest means possible when you're trying to remove something like heavy old paint off of the building. We don't run into this one too often, but archaeological resources can also be affected. I think in this setting, if we're talking about older churches, you might have a cemetery right next to the church, and if you're doing an addition to the church, you're going to need to find out whether or not you have burials within proximity to the footprint of the building. Additions, you should not destroy the historic materials that characterize the property. You should differentiate the architecture in some way so that it is distinctively different, but that it also blends with the original building. But when you look at it, you can understand it as a modern addition to the historic building. And then you also want to make sure that you do the addition in a way so that in the future, if it's removed, that the building remains essentially intact. Okay, what are my eligible expenses? Anything to do with the building envelope, roof, walls, doors, windows, your mechanical systems, your electrical systems, your plumbing, so on and so forth. Your architectural and engineering fees are also included. And if you hire a consultant, their fees are also eligible in the program, which is great. What's not included, new construction, which usually is either additions or outbuildings on the property, landscaping, parking lots, movable equipment, and then equipment specific to something like a restaurant use, like new stoves, refrigerators, and so forth. This is a project that I worked on last year. This is Zion Lutheran Church in Wausau. We put a new roof and gutters on the building. It has a green slate tile roof on it, and some of the tiles were broken and missing, and there was water leaking into the building, and the copper guttering was in pretty tough shape. This one also had an interesting design problem in that on the lower roof below the large arched windows you see there, during the wintertime, snow and ice would fall on that roof along with sometimes a broken tile, and what it would do was it was smashing through the tiles on the lower roof, causing a water infiltration problem. So we came up with a design solution to do a green asphalt roof on that lower roof that matched the color of the upper roof, so that from a distance you can't tell that it's a different roofing material, but when something slides off the main roof, it's going to bounce off of it rather than smashing through it and causing a new water infiltration problem. So sometimes you have to be creative in how you're addressing your problems with your buildings to fix them. Okay, so the application process when you're doing a federal program is first, you make sure that your building is eligible for listing, or if you're starting out with the National Register questionnaire and doing a Part 1. Once the Resources Evaluation Committee has determined that the property is eligible for listing and therefore can move ahead with tax credits, that's when we usually schedule a site visit with the owner to go through the building, talk about your project, and identify what the historic features might be that you might need to save in the building. So then either the owner or the consultant working on their behalf will submit the Part 1, which certifies the property as historic, and then they will also submit the Part 2, which describes all the work that's going to happen and how that works into meeting the standards with the methodology that they're describing. Then we review it, and for federal projects, they do get forwarded on to NPS after us, or National Park Service, excuse me. And we also send off copies of the cover sheets to WEDC, as they are the ones that handle all the money and the contracts. Review times, we're usually at about 30 days at SHPO, and depending on the workload at NPS, it can be 30 to 45 days. Once everything has been approved in writing by both us and the National Park Service, then you can go ahead with your project. And oftentimes when you're working on a project, things will come up. You'll find something when you start peeling back the layers that you didn't realize was underneath there, so you need to amend the scope of work. So you file an amendment requesting the change to what was already approved in the Part 2. You submit supplemental documentation with it, photographs, narratives, and plans if you're going to be changing things. Then once everything is completed on the project, the owner or consultant sends in the Part 3, which certifies the work that everything was completed as prescribed in the Part 2, with photographs documenting the complete project. And we review it, and then it goes on to the Park Service for their review and approval. And once the Park Service signs off on it, then you're done. And okay, again, showing what the timeline and costs are. For us, it's you should plan for total review time of about 60 to 75 days, depending on which agency you're talking about. Usually we turn it around in 30, NPS 30 to 45. Now, the state does not charge any fees. However, the National Park Service does charge some review fees. If your project is under $79,000, they don't charge a review fee. If it's 80,000 to 3.849 million, then it's $845 plus 0.15%. If your project is over the 3.85 million mark, then you just have a flat fee of $6,500. And this particular project here in this slide, this is St. Sebastian Roman Catholic Church in Milwaukee. I'm working on this one presently. We're doing some repairs to the masonry on this building. The parapets needed to be pointed. They did the bell tower last year before they knew about the state-only tax credit program, but they did a great job on it and met the standards on their own, which was great. We're also replacing some flat roofs on the church and the rectory and the gathering space, and also some defunct HVAC equipment. So they're spending about $1 million on this particular project.
Question. Church, now do they get a tax credit? They're paying an income tax, or how do they use the tax credit?
Okay, the question was how do they use the tax credit? What happens is that, well, actually, actually my next couple of slides are going to go into that. Thanks. Okay, in terms of your federal tax credits, you can't sell the federal ones, but you can syndicate them, taking in for-profit partners with them. But it is an IRS issue, so you should be working with tax professionals who know this stuff inside and out, so that, that you are on, everything is copacetic with what you're doing. As far as the state tax credits go, back to your question, those can be sold through a financial institution, and then that money that is bought back from the tax credits can be infused into the project. So, so it's basically you sell for a certain number of cents on the dollar for each of the tax credits, and then you can get that cash back into the project. So here are some fun examples of some adaptive reuses of sacred spaces. These are ones that Dinah found and gave to me to use in this presentation. The top left one is a church that was converted into a dining room. Top right is another one that was converted into retail space. The bottom left was converted into a workout facility. And then the bottom right one was turned into a school. And then, just for fun, you know, Europe is also has some amazing churches and cathedrals, and they've all, you know, joined a secular age as well. So what are they doing with their churches? So I went online and found some really cool examples of some adaptive reuses. Up in the top left, here is a cathedral that was turned into a bookstore in the Netherlands. I did include an exterior shot so you can see what it looks like on the outside. But you can see they added in a floor between the columns on the outside of the main part of the sanctuary. And you can see that they have all their display things for sale in the middle part there. And you can also see the really cool details on the floor as you're walking through the building. Up in the top right is another cathedral in Belgium. And as you can see, the architecture of the building is a very prominent feature in that photograph of the exterior. So, you know, again, like here in the States, you know, our churches are often the most prominent architectural piece in our downtown area. So, you know, retaining that architecture and figuring out a way to reuse it is really important. And of course, since tourism is a huge industry in Europe, as well as in the United States, coming up with interesting ideas to use these buildings for is really important. So you can see the two photographs in the top right are of a hotel suite, as they converted that cathedral into a hotel. And then the last one on the right is of St. Benedict's in England. They turned that into a rock climbing gym, and as you can see, that guy has no fear of heights and is working his way up that rock wall. So, and that's the end of my presentation.
Does anybody have questions?
Yeah, and
it is Paul, it's not a video of Paul, he is there.
Yeah, I'm here so I can actually answer them. Although the sun is kind of blocking me, so I'm kind of seeing silhouettes from here.
You have an existing project that you completed. Can you piggyback on the money you had to spend on the first, if you want to do more on the same building? Can you go reapply, but you got to meet that basis requirement again, and the spending requirement to use it again?
Okay, the question was, now let me see if I make sure I got this right. Asking whether or not you can go back and reapply again if you have a project that is already completed. It was also part of your question asking whether or not you can claim tax credits on the work you've already done.
Yeah, I already claimed it on the work I did.
Okay.
But it needs more work now,
Okay.
20 years later.
Okay.
And,
Okay,
I
so.
can do the basis thing and then spend that much again to get the credit.
Okay. The second part of that question was he did the work 20 years ago and wondering how does the basis figure into the work that he did in terms of figuring it out. But you'll have to actually work with a tax professional to figure that out because they'll have to figure out whether or not the work that you did was depreciable or not. I highly recommend using them for that particular function because my main focus, or at least my wheelhouse of knowledge, is working on making sure that your project meets the standards. So I'm not a tax professional, so I can't really help you with that kind of tax advice. But if you have a CPA or a financial professional that you're working with, they can help you sort all those details out.
You can continue on the same project and do more in the future. Nothing prohibits you from doing it as long as you meet the requirements.
Yeah, correct. You can still always apply for more tax credit projects and continue to work on your building.
If you demolish some significant parts of the building, does it lose its status as a National Register property?
The question was if you demolish significant parts of the building, does that preclude you from being able to apply in the future? In the situation where something like that happens, we would have to look at the building to determine whether or not it still retains its historic character. Sometimes in projects, you're removing a much later addition to a building that doesn't contribute to it. But if you are demolishing parts of the resource that are important, that could very well make it lose its standing in the National Register and then preclude you from being able to apply for tax credits in the future. Sure.
Question.
Yes.
Regarding the first step of certifying that the property is a historic structure, in the case of some works of modernism, like some mid-century structures, you may find that sometimes they're less likely to have been listed on the state or national register already, and also are sometimes more vulnerable to modifications due to disrespect or whatever reason. And so if you want to if you want to save a structure like that, because there may have been some modifications, however minor, if you'd like to reverse that in order to have it listed, in the state of Wisconsin, do you find that CHPO is familiar with that and is willing to consider these opportunities to restore some of the historic fabric that may have been monkeyed with in order to get it listed? That may be presently hampering it from being listed, if you follow me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, we have to look at each building on a case-by-case basis. We have to look to see what is actually still left of the original fabric in the building. I'm thinking of an example. Oftentimes in commercial storefronts, they'll have had a slip cover that was put on at some point, covering up the original historic fabric on the upper floors of the building. And then, of course, storefronts remodel frequently over time, but primarily what we're looking at is the second floor to see if that retains integrity. Sometimes you can do some investigation, some very selective demolition of removing panels or trying to look out from inside through the wall to see if the original features are still intact underneath it. You also have to look at some of those slip covers too to determine whether or not they've actually acquired significance in their own right. Some redesigns from the 40s and 50s that use like vitrolite glass or other interesting pieces like that may have gained significance in their own right. So it's really just investigating, peeling back some layers of that onion to determine how much original fabric do you have here to work with, and what period of significance should the building reflect. Sure.
One thing that you mentioned about putting stuff back, if you lost a bunch of integrity, even putting it back doesn't bring the integrity back because it's still new. Integrity is something that stays very significant. So if you peeled all the fancy gingerbread out of Victoria,
Yeah, I'm working on that project now.
20 years ago, and you put it back now, it's not historic. It just looks closely to what it was, but you can't get it listed because you put something back. Because it's still new. It's new construction with historic. So it has to be like your slip cover. It has to be there and you reveal it, as opposed to reconstructing it and then trying to get it listed. That typically doesn't work.
Is there a sliding scale there? Or is it sort of a binary, yes, no? Because we're already putting back.
Well, putting back is nice, but it doesn't add to the integrity.
Right.
It does qualify, and that's tough for them to explain because there's character defining features which are more damaging to lose than, a piece of trim or something. And so it's every case is unique. It's a matter of going through them, but it's also a partnership because SHPO might be willing to entertain something, but then the Park Service reviews it, or vice versa. So it's always a case-by-case scenario.
Okay.
Excellent, thank you.
You noted something that's a little bit different from what had been the understanding previously of simply a $50,000 investment in a tax credit project. The Department of Revenue earlier this year was looking at the tax code and the state statute and determined that actually you have to meet, because of the way our state statute is written and its reference to the federal code, that you have to meet the adjusted basis value. We had the Department of Justice for the state also look at the language and correct. And that is the current legal opinion of the state that you must meet the adjusted basis value and $50,000 to use the state tax credit. So this means that for most buildings that are that do meet this, they can use the state and the federal credit now together, but you've got to get up to that investment level. But it is still decoupled. The two credits are still decoupled. So nonprofits can still use the state tax credit, but they also have to just flip it on there if that's okay. Yeah. So this is, I think there's going to be a lot more work now for tax attorneys and for people to figure this all out. But again, this is the ruling. There will be a memo coming out to consulting firms and major developers in the state. It'll probably be coming out this week. I'm currently confirming final language with the Department of Revenue. And I think the one thing that we're trying to figure out is what is the date of the implementation of this. Yes, Jen.
I was just wondering, is there going to be any action to try to reverse this, or what would we need to do?
Great. So my understanding at this time is that it may have to be legislative. So the legislature will be back in session in January. So we're sort of looking at this, but again, it is a big political year. We're going to see how the legislature looks coming next year, and there is sort of unofficially, I can say that Nobody's opposed to fixing this because we've all been operating for 10 years with the understanding that this is the way the law worked. And so it doesn't make more work for any agency. That's what agencies care about, is the impact on the budget. But we've all been operating under this. So, but nobody wants to damage the tax credits that do exist. So I guess all of you advocates and people, I can't advocate, I can only educate. So we'll see where it goes. So I guess it's pretty straightforward. It's 50,000 and adjusted basis for right now for any state tax credit. Thank you.
Does that apply to residential as well, or is there still difference?
No, the state tax credit for homeowners, no change whatsoever. That one is still a minimum investment, minimum and maximum, but you can have multiple projects.
And there are enormous implications with what she's talking about. I mean, we really fought hard, John Beck and I, about 13 years ago, to see how this kind of operation can go to small projects in small town Wisconsin. But this idea of 50 plus adjusted base value, that is a much higher standard for restoration projects to go through. So more on that. We're kind of in the middle of it right now, and we'll be figuring something out in the next couple of weeks. We'll maybe get some more clarity on that. And a proper strategy, which is why I think that the Wisconsin Trust is really a good functionary in this matter. Diane can't with Historical Society, but certainly all of us can be advocates for this, and that's really what we need. So if you think you just innocently signed up for our workshop, you'll never hear from us again, sorry.
So I am an architectural historian at UW-Milwaukee. I work on the other side of campus from Matt and his institute. I'm over on the letters and sciences side. I'm part of a research institute. We basically do consulting work with state agencies and municipalities related to historic preservation legal compliance stuff. And then I also get to do a lot of National Register nominations and survey projects all over the state. This presentation came out of a project that I worked on a couple years ago with the Milwaukee Historic Preservation Commission. They received a grant from the Wisconsin Historical Society to look at all of the 20th century houses of worship in Milwaukee. It was a year-long project. We ended up looking at about 250-ish houses of worship and then about 100 ancillary buildings, monasteries, convents, schools, Boy Scout cabins, all sorts of fun stuff. One of the interesting things that came out of this that's, I think, really relevant to what we're talking about today is there is this wealth of post-World War II religious architecture. So I think most of us kind of know this anecdotally, like we're driving around and we're like, hey, that's a cool mid-century church. But we didn't know, I didn't know really quantitatively how many of those were out there. So in our Milwaukee survey, we identified 155 post-World War II houses of worship just in the city of Milwaukee and the city limits. This sort of branched out to the bigger question of how many of these are there in the state. So as Paul sort of hinted at before, there's this inventory database that the Wisconsin Historical Society maintains. It's called the Architecture and History Inventory. It's where you type your address in to see if your building is there. It's not a complete list of all the buildings in the state, but it's a pretty good one. This inventory says there were, I think, 619 post-World War II houses of worship in Wisconsin. My feeling is that that's a low number. I wouldn't be surprised if it was at least double, because there's a lot out there that we don't know about. So what I'm hoping to do, very quickly, I have a timer here, is we're going to do sort of a whirlwind tour of some of these post-war styles and religion houses of worship. So just by way of context, the reason there are so many of these is a couple things. So the population of the country boomed after World War II, the baby boom, we know about this. Population grew by 30 million people in 15 years. So just for reference, the population of the state of Wisconsin is just under 6 million. So picture 5 more Wisconsins being added to the country over a period of 15 years. That's a lot of babies. At the same time, for a lot of sociological reasons, people are going back to weekly religious services at a higher rate than before. So by 1960, almost 2/3 of the entire country was attending weekly religious service. So we have more people, in general, we have more people going back to church and synagogue and temple, and so we need a lot more houses of worship. They weren't all modern styles. At least a third of the churches that I scrolled through in the Historical Society inventory, at least a third of them were historical styles. It's not like World War II happened and traditional architecture stopped. It continued on. It was sometimes not as elaborate as pre-war styles. So you see things like Mount Lebanon in Milwaukee, which is sort of like a stripped down Gothic. There were also a lot of neoclassical or classical tradition buildings like Bayview Baptist. Both of these are from 1957, so like 12 years after World War II. Sometimes architects were looking at traditional styles and sort of pushing the boundaries. This is St. Joseph the Workman in La Crosse, which is an incredible church. If any of you ever get the chance to visit inside, it's amazing. It's like this sort of Art Deco thing on the inside, and then it's like a German expressionist movie on the inside. It's all done in stone, although it kind of looks like timber. One church that sort of illustrates a conundrum that many congregations ran into is this Capitol Drive Lutheran in Milwaukee. So this congregation started in the 1920s. They did some fundraising. They built a foundation, so they built the first story before the war. After World War II finished, they went back to their architect, First and Tilton out of Chicago, and they commissioned this very grand Gothic church. 1945 are the drawings there. They bid it out, and it was 7 times more expensive than they expected. And this was happening to congregations everywhere. Building prices had gone up, building materials had gone up, construction and labor had gone up, and so it was really starting to influence whether congregations could build this kind of really elaborate pre-war Gothic sanctuary that they would have expected 15 years earlier. So Capitol Drive Lutheran ended up with a much simpler kind of modern box, as you see on the right, as it was completed in 1956. So this really illustrates what's happening after World War II. There is this construction boom. There is architects and designers and building committees are starting to look at new building materials and new construction technology, and even new building forms that were sort of suitable to a modern world. And once these ideas all coalesced, designers were really freed from traditional building forms. Religious buildings didn't have to look like religious buildings anymore. Here are 2 synagogues. Congregation of Knesset Israel in Green Bay, really fantastic mid-century building, but does it look like a synagogue? I mean, that could be an orthodontist's office. It could be a bank. It's a really fantastic building, but it doesn't have to look like a sacred building. Same thing with Beth Elner Tamid in Milwaukee on the right. I mean, this is a municipal auditorium to me. Another fantastic building designed by Merzilier, who was a Taliesin fellow, I believe, and really, really fantastic sculpture by a guy named Adolf Regner out of Milwaukee. But again, just illustrating that the whole new range of styles were open to designers. Architects were also looking at interesting new building materials. So the obvious one is like concrete. We're going to talk about that in a bit. But the one that I want to point out here is enameled steel. So this is things that refrigerators and cars are being built out of. This is Holy Redeemer, 1957. The triangular screen across the front is made out of enameled steel. It conceals windows behind it. But what I love about this is that it is a very specific touch point to a period in time, because one of those blues on that enameled screen is the color of Thunderbird blue, the famous convertible that sort of defines this idea of mid-century aesthetics. The Thunderbird had come out 2 years before Holy Redeemer was built. And so this obviously was a color that people would have recognized. It was this sort of a cultural touch point for that specific moment in time. Another material, concrete. St. Edmunds in Elm Grove, possibly the earliest hyperbolic paraboloid structure in the country. There's some debate about that among our colleagues at Docomomo. They're doing some research on that. Does everybody know what a hyperbolic paraboloid is? Because I have a good analogy for this. Okay, so I'm not an engineer, but I know that if you shape concrete in a certain way, it has these magical properties that make it very, very strong. So if you picture a Pringles potato chip, so the sides bend in one direction and the ends bend up in the other direction. That is sort of what a hyperbolic paraboloid is. You can use it on the roof, as it is here, or you can take your Pringles and line them up side by side, and then fill the inside triangles in with glass, as at Zion on the left. I ran across this one in Green Bay quite by accident. I think this might be the sort of budget version of the fancy concrete one on the left. The one on the right, it's just common framing, much cheaper than doing the sort of reinforced concrete idea. So there's also this idea of creating these really sculptural forms. St. Thomas Episcopal in Menasha, Harry Weiss building. This one originally was a very small chapel built in 1916. You can see it at the very right-hand corner. In 1962-ish, there was a fire. The congregation hired Harry Weiss to expand it. He created this giant new addition that sort of turned the original portion into a side chapel. Really incredible space inside. It has a soaring roof, hidden light sort of washing in from all kinds of directions. Really, really interesting sculptural interiors. So another sort of big one is probably one of Wisconsin's best known post-war churches, Annunciation Greek Orthodox in Wauwatosa, designed by Mr. Wright himself. The church it's very, very fascinating. It's a shallow bowl sort of resting on a cross. It has all kinds of symbolism associated with it. It was also influential. Helmut Iongo, who was, he was influenced by a lot of Wright's work, designed Mount Pleasant Lutheran, which takes this idea of a flying saucer even further. I think it's sort of resting there on the ground. You can't really see in this photo, but it has these long rafter tails that extend out. They're sort of spiky, and it's a very interesting building. Of course, Mr. Wright didn't invent the idea of a round church. There are lots others all around. Dorcas Chapel at Marian College in Fond du Lac from 1966. Temple Beth El in Superior, 1963, which is more, it's sort of 12-sided. There's a couple Catholic examples. The Catholic ones are interesting because they are illustrating changes in worship style, changes to liturgy that were taking place. One of the ideas that was coming out of the Second Vatican Council that happened in the early 1960s was ways in which to bring the faith leader and the congregation closer together. And having sort of a theater in the round approach was seen as a good way of achieving that. So there's a lot of Catholic churches that are round-ish coming out of that period in time. On the left is a monastery chapel in Hales Corners. On the right is a convent chapel at Cincinnati that we're going to see more about later this afternoon. A couple architects took that idea even further. On the left is Calvary Baptist. These are round in plan, but they are designed for a very significant historically black congregation in Milwaukee. The architect, William Wensler, is drawing on building traditions of Cameroon. The congregation is exploring this idea of Africanness in the 1970s. And so it's a really, really fascinating kind of neo-expressionist take on using building materials and building technologies and typologies. On the right is St. Patrick's in Lodi. Very nice little church. It has this sort of folded plate roof and this spire in the center. Architects are also looking at other sculptural elements beyond the building itself. One of the things that you'll see a lot in these kind of mid-century post-war churches are freestanding bell towers. And they can be very elaborate, they can be very simple. There's sort of a brutalist one on the left there. There's this spiky concrete one on the right. The one on the left is in Mount Horeb. That's kind of like a Northern European idea. It's this tall copper spire. The one on the right in Milwaukee is Church of the Living God, where it's just a flat geometric framework that sort of continues the geometry of the design. So, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that is happening a lot with these post-war churches is that building committees become more important in the design as opposed to just like one, like the pastor or the priest or someone leading the process. The building committee becomes more important. And there is this explosion of publications in the architectural press, journals, magazines, books, the ideas about building, ideas about worship styles. And so what we see is that new houses of worship start being published by significant architects, and then we see those ideas showing up all over the country. So in Milwaukee, for example, we have Our Lady of Lourdes, which is on the right, which to me feels sort of similar to Carr Chapel at IIT, designed by Mies about 6 years earlier. The same idea about this box, very clean lined, even some of the same materiality. Zion Lutheran in Portland, designed by Beluski, has this really interesting tower. It's sort of like a slatted, I don't even know how to describe it. I'm glad I haven't had to write a building description for this because I wouldn't know what to call it. But it's a square tower with this sort of like slatted nest thing at the top and the spire. But it shows up in Milwaukee, it shows up in Port Washington. I actually found one in Appleton last week. I have a picture on my phone, but I didn't put it in the presentation. So these elements start showing up all over the place. One very influential church was designed by the Finnish-American architect Iliel Saarinen, first Christian in Columbus, Indiana. This is generally considered to be the first modern Protestant church in America, built in 1942. Sometimes the people in the know call this a Saarinen box. There's another type of Saarinen typology that we'll see next, but this is a Saarinen box. It's a very high rectangular volume. The inside typically has a row of windows along one side, so it's like one directional light, and then a row of low columns and a low aisle on one side, on the other side of the interior sanctuary. Typically there's a freestanding tower outside as well, tall, blocky, rectangular. These Saarinen boxes were very influential. There were 8. Tim, I'm looking at you, but you won't remember this. There's 8 or 9 of them in Milwaukee. Clearly very influential. So what we're looking at here, there is on the right, or on the left is First Christian, the Saarinen one in Columbus. In the middle is one of the ones from Milwaukee, Beautiful Savior, built in 1958 by Harry Olraga. Again, it has that row of windows along one side. It has the low side aisle on the other side. On the right, you can see how this architect for First Congregational in Sheboygan took the idea even further and sort of pushed the idea further. There's 2 side aisles, and there's sort of the windows become almost clerestory windows. I wanted to include First Congregational because in 1960, this church won the award from the Church Architectural Guild of America. It won the gold medal. And in accepting the award, the architect had a long statement, but one of the things that he said I think is very relevant because it sums up sort of what designers and congregations were thinking about with buildings at this time period. The architect James McNutt said, over the years, plan requirements, materials, and techniques have changed to the extent that it is no longer feasible to force today's functions into preconceived forms. Today, church architecture must capture the principles that give greatness to the churches of the past without subservience to traditional plans and forms. So I think that is an interesting sort of peek inside the minds of how designers were thinking about these new spaces. Two Catholic examples of a Saarinen box. One is in Kimberley on the left, one is in Whitefish Bay on the right. So in addition to the Saarinen box, we also have a Saarinen roof, labeled so because these buildings are all roof. Here's another one in Columbus, Indiana, the first one, the most influential one, built in 1964. There are these a row of clerestory windows underneath this very broad roof. The building is sort of sunken down into the ground, and then there's this spire that reaches heavenward. Highly influential form. Here are two by Helmut Iongo, one in Mineral Point from 1974, one in Milwaukee from 1996. Two more, one in Eau Claire from 68, and then one in Albany, which was built in 1985. So very recent, very popular form that keeps showing up over and over and over. So probably one of the most ubiquitous mid-century religious forms for churches is the A-frame. This is the one that started it all. Concordia Theological Seminary, Eero Saarinen, again, architect, 1957. An A-frame is just what it sounds like. It's just like the house. Triangular front, slanted walls. They can come all the way down to the ground. They may not. Part of the reason A-frames were so popular is because of glue laminated beams. We all know what glue lams are. They have a specific Wisconsin connection. The technology was developed as a collaboration between Unit Structures up in Peshtigo and Forest Products Laboratory at the University of Wisconsin. And this new technology of glue lam beams really made a lot of these kinds of churches popular and possible. Here's a very early one, very simple A-frame, sort of like rustic. The roof just comes all the way down to the ground. You could also put some sidewalls in so the roof didn't come down all the way. As on the right at Holy Name in Wausau, there are the sidewalls there. Another reason for the huge popularity of the A-frame churches was that they were very, very open to a lot of kinds of symbolism. So because post-war congregations are not able to spend as much money on the kind of traditional detailing as they would have, they start looking at more abstract symbolism, ways to incorporate that into their buildings. So on the left, for example, we have St. Peter's in Broadhead. This is a perfect triangle. Triangle equals Trinity. Lutherans love the Trinity. This is good symbolism. The churches could suggest ships or boats. Here's Zion and Madison, Trinity Baptist and Fond du Lac. Here's one in Middleton, St. Bernard's. And you really get a sense of the interior of this space. It's like the hull of a ship. You can really see through these parabolic trusses. The trusses could also be sort of swoopy. It could be like a tent. One in Ripon, one in Frederick. Oftentimes when these are sort of like the concave trusses like this, the designers left a slit along the top. So there's this strip of light that goes down the middle of the window. Here's one you can sort of see that effect. There's this strip of light down the center. The exterior of this one is treated differently. This one almost becomes sort of like a mansard roof. There's a subset of A-frame churches This typically called prow front. So a prow front is like the prow of a ship. The front wall can come to a peak. The ceiling or the roof overhangs in a long overhangs, has a pointy quality. One of the most famous ones, the Unitarian Meeting House, designed by Wright. But there are other examples that show up as well. Trinity Reformed in Brown Deer. This one is by Redham and Doman, 1960. It has, you can see the prow, which is solid here instead of being glass, as at the Unitarian Meeting House. St. Michael's in Wausau by Henry Slaby chops off the prow. So it becomes this void that has these tall windows and entry portals. At St. Michael's, you can't really see it, but there are also clerestory windows that run underneath the roof around the whole building. So it has this really, really interesting interior effect with the light. Prow fronts come in a whole variety of sizes and styles. I tried to show these two at about the same scale here in the photo. Cross Lutheran in Burlington by Charles Stade is this tiny little jewel box church. It's wonderful. It's great. St. Matthias in Milwaukee is enormous. The church seats 3,000 people. It is huge. That front window is 37 feet at its highest point. It's an enormous church, and I think looking at these two together really illustrates the flexibility of the prow front at a variety of scales. One other important thing about these churches is that often there was a greater emphasis on integrated allied arts. So designers were thinking about the interiors as sort of a cohesive whole from the beginning, instead of designing the building and then letting somebody else go out and buy the furniture and the banners and everything. So that shows up in things like integrated mosaics. Here's one in Milwaukee that depicts the Tree of Life. Integrated sculpture. Here is one in Milwaukee depicting Jesus, who is dressed in his traditional robes, and the children, who are dressed in little 1959 clothes. Stained glass, very simple geometric patterns here at the Lutheran Chapel of the Cross, also designed by Charles Stade. And there's this material that I feel is very polarizing, but I want to highlight it. It's dalle de verre. Dalle de verre is, literally means slab glass. So this consists of sort of this chunky glass. It's usually about 1.5 inches thick or so. And then it's set into a matrix of concrete or epoxy. The dalle de verre is structural, which means that it can be used to support the roof. It also can be made in much larger segments. There's a fascinating connection between dalle de verre and Wisconsin. If you have questions about this, I am happy to talk more later. But for now, Bernard Grenke, one of the important early leaders of Conrad Schmidt Studios in New Berlin, he patented the technique that's used for all dalle de verre in this country today. He was financed by Marie Kohler of the Kohler Foundation. So we sort of have Marie Kohler to thank for dalle de verre glass in this country. Again, talk to me later because I have a whole story. Okay, so dalle de verre can be used in a whole variety of applications. Here are the St. Matthias windows. Figural, representational figures from the Old Testament. St. Margaret Mary uses it in strips in between these sort of fan-shaped window plates or wall plates. Holy Family, it shows up in polka dots. The congregation here calls this their aquarium, which I think is great. Mother of Good Counsel in Milwaukee, the dalle de verre is arranged in sort of this sweep of color from the back to the front. Here is the interior of the chapel at Sinsinawa, which we'll be seeing more about this afternoon. I wanted to include this one because all of the windows and the metal screens behind the altar were designed by Sister Teresita Kelly. She was an art professor at Edgewood College. She was also a Dominican sister. And so I think we might be hearing more about her later on, possibly. So just to wrap up, so a lot of these post-World War II churches that we've seen, they're at a really vulnerable point in their life cycle. Here is, on the right is Trinity Baptist, I'm sorry, on the left, Trinity Baptist as it looked in 2008. This is the image that I showed at a conference last Friday. After the conference, somebody sent me an image of what the church looks like now. They have covered over the window with vinyl siding. They've re-roofed it. The window is still intact inside, but they've covered the outside. I think there's a lot of things happening here. The buildings are getting to be 50-ish years old, 60 years old. Exterior envelopes are starting to fail. Mechanical systems need replacing. They're expensive to take care of. There's also this issue of aesthetics. So all buildings go through cycles of taste. Here's an example in Milwaukee that's sort of thorny. There's a lot to unpack here, but the short version is, this is a 19th century church. It was built in 1872. Suffered some pretty serious interior damage in the early 1960s, and it was altered to reflect a modern sensibility. The interior was changed. These new windows were commissioned. They were really incredible, installed in 1966. In 2007, a new religious order took over the church and decided that they wanted to take the church back to a 19th century appearance. So they ripped out the 1966 windows and commissioned new windows that were not replicating anything that was there before. These were complete fabrications in a 19th century style. This is an interesting case because I would argue that those secretary standards that we saw earlier, the 1966 windows had achieved significance in their own right, and the 2014 windows are creating a false sense of history. Also, just on a personal level, the depictions of some of the things in the windows, what we're looking at here is St. Thomas Aquinas, the Catholic philosopher saint, trampling Martin Luther. Presented without comment. Okay, so I'm running over time here a little bit, but this idea of cycles of taste. So buildings go through cycles of taste. So here is this house built in 1882, this Queen Anne house. When it's built in 1882, it is the height of fashion. This is the style. Everybody wants a house that looks like this. By 1950, this is the ugliest thing imaginable. We are remodeling them, we are tearing them down. We can't get rid of them fast enough because they're old, they're big, they're expensive, they're ugly. By 2004, all of us right now would probably look at this and say, that's a really great Queen Anne house. I'm glad it survived this long. So there are these cycles of taste that happen with buildings. Here's a church from 1965. This is St. Veronica's in Milwaukee. I showed this photo to a friend of mine, and he said it looks like a mall food court. So if that, and this is a non-architect friend, what do all of us, because all of us understand the importance of retaining buildings because of their ability to talk about the period in which they were built, the values. How do we talk to people like that who see these kind of buildings like at their absolute low point right now? We have to make sure that these buildings last another 50 years to the point where they're cool again. So I guess that sort of wraps up my presentation. So here's a link to the report we did in Milwaukee with all of the houses of worship if you want to take a look at that. I'm also happy to answer questions later. And I would just put in another plug for that Wisconsin Architecture and History Inventory. There's tons of information in there, and the folks at the Historical Society are wonderful, wonderful resources. Okay.